because when you mentioned about legislations, you rightly stated that there was one that was instated in 2016. There was another domestic violence bill that was initiated in 2004. That was then amended in 2020, if I remember correctly, but it still hasn't been enacted. So there's always this gap between the de jure rules and the de facto what's actually implemented. And we've seen there hasn't been any. There have been certain micro level efforts in certain parts of Pakistan, but I mean more homogeneously, there hasn't been a more top down approach. Even if we look at parental leave bills, they were implemented in the federal capital, but not elsewhere, things like that. So there's this disharmony about what has been enacted. And the other thing is that you rightly pointed that education is one tool or one instrument through which we can tend to nudge the way people think and behave. And obviously it boils down to social structures and cultural norms. But in your experience, have you seen any of that working in Pakistan at the moment? Working with religious leaders, like you mentioned, has that borne any fruit? Because again, I don't want to paint a gloomy picture, but when we see every March, the kind of criticism, and actually criticism is a very, I would sanitize word, but the criticism that the Aurat March tends to face, I mean, personally for me, it's very disappointing. It's hurtful to say the least, and you would expect that year on year things would get better, but on the contrary, it doesn't seem so. And now, the flows to you. What do you think? What in your experience have you seen? Are there small windows of hope, of opportunity that you witness, or?
So to say that you don't want to paint a gloomy picture is an understatement of how gloomy the picture actually is. When you're working on this issue, you recognize the monstrosity of the problem and what it will take to change, like to chip away on some of the manifestations or prevalence of gender-based violence. And then you take into account what is being done, which is next to nothing, at a more, as you mentioned, there is a need for a concerted effort at every level. Public level, private sector level, public sector, private sector, individual, social, every entry point needs to be checked out, and a concerted effort needs to be put into reforming what needs to be reformed for there to be a decline in the incidence of gender-based violence. That is not happening. There is great work being done at a micro level, which is hopefully going to create a ripple effect, and lives of some women and girls would be impacted, but it's not enough to have a paradigm shift in the way the society is framed. Specifically speaking of Aurat March, I think it's a great example of the pushback that we are facing when in the realm of, dare I use the word, feminist advocacy. So I think, first of all, it's important to realize that this is not just a Pakistan-specific problem. It's a global issue where we made some gains from Beijing to Beijing plus 25. There was a global drive towards eliminating violence, towards ensuring that there was gender equality. And now there has been severe pushback from the divisive elements that we see in society today. It's sad that it is more pronounced in Pakistan. Aurat March is a great initiative. I think it started in 2018 on the International Women's Day, if I'm not wrong, and has been gaining momentum since, but the pushback is more severe. I think a lot gets lost in a misunderstanding of concepts too, right? Everybody wants to debate it. Sometimes around that time when you turn on your news channels, which have now become machinery of propaganda, yeah. There's very few feminists and people from within the field that work on human rights law, women's rights laws, or advocates and activists that get airtime to speak about the issue, to educate public on what it truly is. What is the Aurat March manifesto? Addressing gender inequality dismantling the patriarchy and challenging patriarchal norms that are not only harmful towards women and girls, but they're harmful towards men themselves. Like these are just harmful, irrespective of gender. Patriarchy hurts everybody. So dismantling those, being intersectionally inclusive, demanding, I think, equality in the law and legal reforms. So these are just the ones that I recall off the top of my head. But at no point is this a man. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. At this point, just for for some of our viewers and our audience, it might be helpful for them to understand the jargon, which I mean, you and I, we do understand. We work in this sphere, but what do you mean when you say dismantling patriarchy? What do you say when when you're talking about intersectionalism? All these terminologies. If you could just further elaborate it, for people who are listening in, it might be more interesting. Yeah.
Patriarchy, and I think I forget the name of this very noble female leader of Pakistan. She translated it beautifully in Urdu for those who understand. Pidar Shahi Nizam. So it is a mentality where women's autonomy is discounted and controlled, and there's this element of controlling women and girls because they do not have the autonomy or the agency to act, or are not allowed to exercise their agency, because the idea is that the men in their lives, or the men in society, or the male counterparts have a better understanding of how it should be, or they should be given preferential treatment over women and girls. So that's the most layperson way of understanding patriarchy. And all of the social norms that we see are generated through it. There's undertones of misogyny in it. Misogyny is essentially hating the idea of women and exercising power over them. At the crux of it all, at the core of it all, I should say, is the idea that women need to be controlled, be it through, I'm trying to think of like an easy example in the household, how permissions work, how decisions about female education works. If it's a son, he gets to go to high school. If it's a daughter, she needs to get married, because or even if she becomes a doctor, it is not so that she would be in the workforce serving the population as a physician, but rather because she would then be an eligible bride for marriage. Like that's the criteria and which is why we have a dearth in the doctor population in the country as well, which I would claim is a form of violence against women, because you train so hard. Anyway, besides the point. But these are just some core examples of how patriarchy manifests. And when we talk about intersectionality means that there's a distinction. Yes, there's the gender distinction, but even within the gender distinction, not everyone is equal. Women that belong to a rural area in Pakistan do not experience life the same way as women from an urban population would experience life. So that is one intersectional difference, that although both of them may have experienced violence, their experience of violence will be different, or their identity is different because of that divide. Put onto it the many layers of socioeconomic strata that you belong to, your education level, the religious caste of sect that you associate with or your family belongs to, and then the provincial divide, whether you're from Punjab or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Balochistan, Sindh, Kashmir, any of the areas that come under within the realm of Pakistan. Each area has its own cultural and social ways of being, and that impacts the identity. So all of those identities need to be considered when we are trying to bring gender equality into the country, or at least start with prevention of gender-based violence within the country.